this a big victory for Obama with his latest long form. And he may have been born in Hawaii. The point is they've been covering something up for 2 years, and that birth certificate has been altered. Probably on purpose to keep it on this debate instead of his real record, which they don't want people to look at. Meanwhile, Obama's approval rating remains at all-time low for second week in a row, says Gallup, despite the latest stunt. Also, Washington Times reports birth certificate isn't Obama's only secret. The White House is still saying we're not going to release his college. Any of the rest of it, big cover-ups going on that front. That is just some of what we're going to be discussing, and the economic news today with economist Webster Tarpley, also historian. Economic growth slow as inflation measures spikes up. That is just some of what we're going to be breaking down. But it's funny. Tarpley got here about 12 minutes ago or so during the break, and I said, Tarpley, what do you want to talk about today? And he said, first, I want to... It's great to have him here in studio with us. He said, first I want to talk about this spectacle, the royal wedding. And I said, absolutely, that was my first issue. And I said, what do you want to talk about second? Well, the birth certificate, exactly as of the same mind. And then we'll get into the economy and Libya and Fukushima and all of it with him for the full next hour. Then Dr. Bob Bowman will be in studio with us. And Tarpley's here to be interviewed for a documentary film on the Tea Party and how they've co-opted the left with Obama, now the right with the co-opted Tea Party that they claim was founded by Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck when it was founded almost 4 years ago by 9/11 Truth, and then picked up by Ron Paul 3.5 years ago. And some media does admit the truth of that, but it's interesting to understand how the globalists are trying to control the left-right populist awakening that's happening. So we'll cover that full spectrum. But I put out a video 2 days ago that's had over 200,000 views and has been picked up by the London Telegraph and others. Basically, they're raising the alarm like body snatchers, hissing at me that I'm not a royalist, and that I dare say the spirit of America is about not being entitled, these hereditary kings, these German usurpers of England. No, I'm not saying Germans are bad, folks. I'm part German. The point is they are usurpers. I'm not over in Germany, claiming I'm the king there, from Texas. And people are like, well, why are you covering the royal wedding? It's pop. It's a diversion. Yes, we're covering it and illustrating that they create these Bernaysian, sycophantic events like they're celebrities, and they have all the celebrities there bowing and kowtowing to create the illusion this is something wonderful and valuable while saying, oh, they're ceremonial, they have no power, when it's the opposite. And I see Canadians, British, other Commonwealth holdings in denial that she declares war. That she can have whole tribes kicked off islands for U.S. military bases, that when I was in London last, they were announcing as I did a tour bus, well, the Queen has closed these roads today. She does that to let us know she owns them and that she owns half the country and doesn't allow billboards nationally and shuts the Thames occasionally to exercise power. And Canada 3 times in the last year, she suspended Parliament through her Governor General. And folks say, oh, that's just titular. That's just vestigial. That's just ceremonial. That's just blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. I've read the Governor General agreements, but we have a historian, an expert who has a doctorate in the whole Venetian system into the British Empire on this specific subject. So for all of you Brits and others who are in denial about this, here is the Times of London. Islanders accuse Queen of illegal eviction. Then they go on and admit 6 years ago in Diego Garcia kicking the giant native population off so that it could be a secretive B-52 reloading weapons base to menace the Middle East. I mean, here's the Times of London. Stop living in denial, okay? Stop it, okay? They have the Parliament with its 2 houses, the House of Lords and the Parliament, and then they've got the Queen. And her Queen's speech sets the agenda. They're the ones that want the eugenics on record. They had the Royal Population Commission in 49 that was cited as U.S. policy in State Department Memorandum 273. Well, I'm ranting. Webster, the rest of this segment, the next segment, let's focus on the royal wedding, break it down, the true power, what this spectacle is all about. Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for your spirit, right? The righteous indignation against this monstrosity. Certainly, if you look at what these American networks have done with this event, I think this is really a revolting spectacle. Once Queen Elizabeth was asked about what her ideology was, and her answer was, we are older than capitalism and socialism. And it's true, because what she represents is feudalism. This is a feudal or neo-feudal degenerate that heads up this family. Now, she's not an absolute monarch. This is an oligarchical monarchy. But the power of the monarch within the oligarchy is very considerable, as you've been...
well, it's also, they're all intermarried. It's hereditary. It's a gang. It's like the La Cosa Nostra.
Maybe we just give some examples. I think if you wanted to look at this, do a short summary. You could organize it around themes like insanity, in other words, mental degeneracy, which they have very, very heavily, and then support for genocide.
Because inbreeding, even with the Egyptians, a lot of their folks only lived at age 5 or so. I mean, inbreeding causes...
It says Dieu est mon droit, and that Dieu est mon droit means incest is fine as long as you keep it in the family. George III was stark raving mad, the tyrant. Queen Victoria, for the last 40 years of her life, was a recluse who ran a death cult around her dead husband, Prince Albert, and she had seers, occultists, apparitionists, Ouija boards.
Same thing with Tony Blair. That's where this starts.
Well, poor Tony, one of the things we have today is that this was a hard right turn by the monarchy today, because neither of the two Labor Party guys, not Tony Blair and not Gordon Brown, were invited today. So this is really one of the most important political...
Well, Webster, I'm relishing this. Stay there. We'll be right back to break down this disgusting spectacle. All right, Webster, you've got the floor. Start breaking down why this royal wedding is so abhorrent. People say, well, just ignore it if it's bad. No, this is how they're selling themselves as a propaganda ploy to the world.
It's an exercise in brainwashing the American people on a pretty vast scale. Again, George III was stark raving mad. There was even a movie about that some years ago. Victoria spent 40 years of her life as a recluse, practically never going outside. She lived in Balmoral Castle. Some years ago, the prescription records of the local pharmacy were found. She was an opium addict in the form of laudanum, which was a tincture, a solution of opium in alcohol that they would use. And she was known as Mrs. John Brown because she spent all of her time with this Scottish, rustic, right, who lived there. And he basically had the adjoining bedroom. So that was Mrs. John Brown. Other examples would be, you look at Prince Philip, right? He wants to come back reincarnated as a deadly virus to kill people and solve the problem of overpopulation in the world. I mean, that statement goes beyond anything Hitler ever said in public, right? That you want to kill people for the purpose of lowering the population. Prince Charles, right? The father of the groom. What's with him? He says he talks to plants. All right, fine, anybody can talk to plants. But then he added, and they answer me. So when the plants start answering you, then you know that you're pretty much in trouble.
But we know medically that inbreeding, it doesn't just cause deformities, it always causes insanity, megalomania. And here is an inbred group of megalomaniacs in these 17th century commander outfits festooned with medals, with women all over the world buying teacups and throwing flowers at them. This is like groveling at the feet of a cesspit. It's like bathing in maggot leavings.
It's well said. The great uncle of the pair, right, the couple who got married today, was Prince Albert Victor Edward, known as Prince Eddie. And according to most historians, he is the main suspect of being Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
And not that he was necessarily insane to start with.
Well, syphilis. Syphilitic.
Syphilis, and he probably died of syphilis.
Dripping scrofula.
Okay. But apart from this now, the insanity is one thing, but then this affinity for Nazism and the affinity for genocide. Now, the key guy, of course, is King Edward VIII, who was a close personal friend of Hitler. This is about 1936, right? He was forced out very soon.
When the war started, he had to run out through Portugal. He was busy groveling at Hitler's feet.
He was a volunteer to Hitler to become the viceroy of a Nazi puppet state in Great Britain. If Hitler had conquered the British Isles, he would have come forward and say, make me, in effect, the king.
He'd be the British equivalent of a Vichy.
Of Marshal Pétain. He would have been the Marshal Pétain, except he would have said, I'm a member of the royal family. And when you think about it, that would have meant that Nazism would have come into Canada and into Australia and into New Zealand because of the way the British...
And it would have gotten the British intelligence network. Hitler would have won at that point.
Hitler would have gotten a foothold in the North American continent.
No, Hitler linked up with the British Empire would have been unstoppable. Don't you agree?
Yes. Well, it would have been a very grave thing, but it would have meant that a lot of institutions in the empire, a lot of United Empire loyalists would have immediately said, well, if the king is Edward and he's supporting Hitler, then we have to support Hitler too. So that's the entire history of this British oligarchy. I mean, it's not just...
Well, let's continue. Back in 1 minute. Let's continue, Webster, because I want to finish up with some of the history, then get to this current spectacle. They have to hide most of the royals because they're so mentally ill and deformed. They trot out the few that can actually talk. Doctor of History, economist, Webster Griffin Tarpley is our guest for the rest of the hour. Then Dr. Bob Bowman's coming in. I'm tempted for a segment or two to have these two in here together. That'd be a very interesting event. When last time we had that was when they were on C-SPAN at my 9/11 event in 2006 that had such a big effect. Webster, you were going through some of the history of these people we worship in this short segment. When we come back, I want to look at the real power they wield, suspending parliaments, kicking natives off islands, funding genocide, a really nasty lot. But she's such a sweet old lady.
Yeah, the history of it, of course, is something quite different. If you wanted to focus on one person in the entire 1,000-year history of the British monarchy, right, going back to William the Conqueror in 1066, it would probably be King Edward VII. Now, he was king, formally speaking, pretty much in the first decade of the 20th century. So about 100 years ago, he died. So he'd been in power from about 1900 to 1909 or 1910. However, since Victoria had been this recluse for 40 years, he was in effect the acting king. And this is the one case where the monarch coincides with the leader of the oligarchy. In other words, he combined both posts. Sometimes you'll have the monarch as some weak figure and the oligarchy has a different leader. But King Edward VII has got both of these.
A real tyrannus.
Not exactly a tyrannus. Again, it's an oligarchical system. It's not a French-style, Louis XIV absolute monarchy or something like this. It's a doge, right? He's like a doge, but of Venice, but if he can lead the oligarchy. And what he did, this is the person who basically organized most of the historical tragedies from about 1860 until his death. And World War I is really his handiwork. Edward VII is the guy who created the Triple Entente. In other words, Britain, France, and Russia against Germany. The encirclement of Germany.
And they started the hype that the rise of Germany is a threat.
Exactly.
They didn't even mince words. They said they're too economically powerful, too many scientists, too many patents. We've got to start a war with them.
Right, and this can teach us a lot about our current period, because the U.S.-China relationship today is a kind of an echo of the British-German relationship at the time, and of course that led to a world war. So he set up this alliance system, right? This idea that in 1914, when something happened in Europe, the only thing that was possible was if France started to mobilize, then everybody else had to mobilize. And once everybody started to mobilize, then war was a foregone conclusion. So Edward VII is somebody who set that up. He made a trip to North America, the first visit by at least a Prince of Wales to North America in 1860. It's thought that he helped get the American Civil War going. He did a number of things like this. So Edward VII, you'd have to say, is the indispensable person for causing World War I. Out of World War I comes World War II, pretty much directly, Nazism, communism, eventually the Cold War. The entire pattern of world history since Edward VII has been shaped as a tragedy, right, as a catastrophe.
It's all orbiting this creature.
Yeah, he is considered their greatest activist, right? In other words, their most successful political guy since William the Conqueror would be Edward VII. All right, we mentioned Edward VIII as a Nazi, and this he clearly was. Of course, not just him. There was a whole faction in the House of Lords, the so-called Cliftonset. It's written Cliveden, but Cliftonset. This is Lady Astor, Lord Astor, a whole group of dukes and lords and others who were all pro-Hitler. And this is the group that supported Chamberlain, right? The appeasement, so-called appeasement policy, which was really just support of Hitler. And did they learn anything from this stuff, right? After 1945, you could say, well, they were fooled by Hitler, many were fooled by Hitler. Prince Philip, this is a guy from a Greek-Dutch family.
Which is originally German. Stay there. Let's just come right back, because I got these idiot emails going. He's Greek and Dutch. Well, the Dutch royal family's German, ladies and gentlemen. And you're like, well, why are they then attacking Germany? Some say it might have been Germany's mistake to not basically kneel to this monarchic family, who they originally came from. We'll be right back. Stay with us on the other side. All right, doctor of historian, economist Webster Tarpley's here. He's breaking down the royal wedding, and we're going to get into the real power of the British monarchy, the crown. These pretenders to the throne. The throne itself is a fraud, and what this modern spectacle is all about. Then we're getting into the birth certificate and Tarpley's view on that. We're getting into the economy, the wars, and we'll get to some of your phone calls. Dr. Bob Bowman is also coming up in studio. I've got them both here to be interviewed for a film, so we're killing two birds with one stone, and also doing radio interviews. Always great to have them. Okay, Webster, you were going through the build-up to World War I, World War II, the British orchestrating that, their eugenics, Nazi support. Let's continue.
All right, so Edward VII, if anybody is the architect of the catastrophe of the 20th century, Edward VII is right up there. He's at least a real contender. The question I think that your email question touched on is, what is the name of this family? Who are they, right, this royal family? Today they call themselves Windsor. They decided to call themselves Windsor in about 1916, 1917, when all of those millions of British getting killed in the First World War that Edward VII had set up. There was a huge anti-German hysteria in Britain. Up until that time, they'd been calling themselves the ruling house of Hanover, and they'd been going by that name since George I had come over, right, around 1710. But the real name of it is, you've also said, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, or Sachsen-Coburg-Gotha, or Guelph. Guelph being the anglicized version of Welf, W-E-L-F. Die Welfen, that is what the House of Hanover used to call themselves. So this is the family that now call themselves Windsor. Prince Philip of again, a Greek-Danish branch of this family, is the guy who wants to come back as a virus. But the question was, after 1945, did they learn that Nazism was bad? Well, who was Prince Philip's best friend? His best friend was Prince Bernard of Holland.
Another relative, another German princeling dispatched to fertilize Queen Beatrix, the princess. And expanding on that, for those that are not aware of this, when I say they began what is Nazism, that was only one branch of the eugenics movement that they heavily financed starting in the 1850s through Galton. This is all mainline history.
In the case of Philip, his best friend, lifelong friend, was Prince Bernard of Holland, and that, of course, is the founder of the Bilderberger Group. In a way, you could say the Bilderberger Group, the royal patrons of that Bilderberger phenomenon, were Prince Philip and are Prince Philip still, and now the late Prince Bernard. What's with Prince Bernard? He was a minor, not very wealthy German nobleman, not even a prince. I think he was the ruler, maybe the Duke or the Count of Detmold Lippe for sure. And he married the House of Orange, which is either they're the richest in the world or the Windsors. It's between Orange and Windsor.
And that's a big state secret. They're so powerful, they successfully have had the AP agree to never photograph them even in public.
All right. Bernard had been, when he had been in the university in Berlin in the late 1920s, he had joined the Nazi stormtroopers. He was a brown shirt. He was a member of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. But then it was realized, of course, that he was on his way to...
So he left Germany, ran back, and as the German planes are invading, he does photo op shooting at them.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Before he did that, he went from the SA brown shirt stormtroopers to the SS black shirt elite, and not just the...
Who pledged total fealty to Adolf Hitler.
And he was a member of the Reiter SS. In other words, the part, there was a subdivision of the SS, the elite of the elite, la crème de la crème, where in order to get into that one, you had to be a noble. So he was a key figure in that. Then when he married Princess of Orange, there, the future queen, then Juliana, I guess it was, he had to basically resign from all of his Nazi Party offices. So Prince Philip never learned not to be friendly with Nazis. He was a friend of Prince Bernhard all his life. It just never ended.
And he makes constant statements on TV. He'll go, he's obsessed and obsessive compulsive. If he sees a light bulb that's burnt out in a palace, he publicly says, there must be blacks working in here.
Now, his racism, very good point. The question of Lady Diana about 12 years ago, right? Princess Diana, Lady Diana Spencer, Princess Diana. She had married Charles, of course, and Charles was an adulterer. He had Camilla Parker Bowles on the side. It's typical of the family. His brother, his younger brother, Prince Andrew, known as Randy Andy, was also a rake, an adulterer.
Well, I tell you, Camilla Parker Bowles, she looked like roadkill 50 years ago.
Today she was wearing a champagne dress, which I guess has something to do with the fact that whenever you pick up the Globe in these supermarket tabloids, it's always that she's drunk again and having a drunken fit. But Princess Diana, after having divorced Prince Charles, right, since her life with him was unbearable, she was going to marry Dodi Fayed. Now, Dodi Fayed, of course, this is the son of Al Fayed, who had bought this Harrods department store in London, except for about 10 or 15 years, there was a huge feud between Al Fayed, I guess of Egypt, and Tiny Rowland. And Tiny Rowland was a guy who worked with and for the British royal family. So there had been a kind of a conflict between Al Fayed and the royal family through Tiny Rowland. At the point that Princess Diana was going to marry Dodi Fayed, she was going to convert to Islam. So you would have had a situation, including today, if this had gone otherwise, if she had lived, you would have had the Queen Mother of England, or Queen of England, depending, well, of course, by the time she converted, she wouldn't have been queen. But the Queen Mother, for sure, she would have remained, would have been a Muslim. And this would have happened about 1999, 2000, 2001.
The word is she was pregnant.
Just in time for 9/11, we would have had the whole clash of civilization strategy completely negated because the Queen Mother of England is a Muslim. So this was unacceptable. And this was a kind of her death.
And this, of course, was the
arranged.
This was the estranged Diana showing them, I'll go get myself a Muslim consort.
Her death is impossible to explain without some kind of...
And over 80% of the Brits on record and polls say they killed her. And she made a videotape and a diary and told her butler, Charles told me he's going to kill me in a fake auto accident, which is British and U.S. intelligence agencies' favorite way to kill you.
And, of course, Prince Charles is one possible factor. I think you'd also have to include Prince Philip.
And the reason people are going to say, well, why are you going into all the details? It could go on for hours, folks.
It's true.
Well, this is who we're being told is loving and good, but has no power. Now, let's get into their real power. Earlier, I read the Times of London. Islanders accuse Queen of illegal eviction from Diego Garcia, the island, now turned into a giant U.S. refueling weapons base in the Indian Ocean. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, and they kicked out 3,000 of the tribes that's lived there for basically ever, and she just says that she's the queen. If she has no power, she gave the order. How does she suspend parliaments? What is her real power? What is her real position? Like the Dutch, her wealth is secret.
First of all, she is fabulously wealthy. I mean, she doesn't appear on these lists. When you see something that says, Warren Buffett or Bill Gates is the richest...
And they advertise her allowance in taxpayer money, the billions for heating the palaces and the rest of it, as if that's the only money.
She has a large fortune, which does not appear because it is held through this, I think it's called Coutts, C-O-U-T-S, is the bank that handles her personal finances. Anyway, there are trusts and other things that you don't see that she owns, right? It's rumored that she owns a good part of the real estate in Manhattan, right? That would already make her fabulously wealthy. She can dissolve Parliament anytime she wants. She can just send them all home. She has to appoint the person who tries to become prime minister. You want to try to form a government, you have to go through her. She has governor generals. The governors general. Let's go through the governors general. I think the most eloquent examples that I could cite were in 1975, you had this guy, Gow Whitlam in Australia, who was trying to set up an alternative energy supply for Australia. He was trying to make direct oil for technology deals with Middle East oil producers, a very good thing to do. And he was then ousted, and ousted by the actions of the royal governor general, because there was a conflict between two branches of parliament.
But now the reverse is happening. 3 times they try to kick out Harper. She comes in and dissolves so he can stay in.
Right. We've had this repeatedly, and even before that, I think a very good example is under Mulroney, so-called Mal René among the Quebecois. Mulroney was the guy who brought you free trade, right? The giant sucking sound in the form of NAFTA. There was a large opposition in the Canadian Senate. There was no majority for this NAFTA monstrosity, so the Queen obliged Mulroney by appointing new senators, packing the Canadian Senate so that there would be a majority for this free trade treaty, which I think everybody, including Canada, has suffered under. So the power of these governor generals is extensive. She gets these red boxes. All the top secret documents from the SIS, from MI5, MI6, the whole British intelligence establishment, like the Treasury. She gets these red boxes and she reads them. And the entire bureaucracy serves her. The entire loyalty, right? All the officers in the army are monarchists and royalists.
Well, she has patronages. They still hand out houses and lands and little goodies.
Right, we just had the Maundy gifts, right, where she gives a piece of gold for every year of her age to these poor commoners. Ultimately, what it inculcates is the sense of being a subject, in the sense of being an inferior person. In other words, there's a sovereign, that's her, and there's a subject, and that's you, and you're a subject to the whims of the sovereign. So it's a completely degraded system. It is a feudal relic. And of course, it's a terrible index of the degradation of the United States that people put up with this, right? And now you also look.
Well, stay there. I'm going to come back because they're really the big progenitors of the New World Order, eugenics, world population, Malthusian death cult. Webster and I were just in here rolling, talking about the fact that they've issued 3 of the same birth certificate, each one with different seals and watermarks on it, and it's clear they wanted to make this the debate. They don't want to talk about Obama and the lobbyist and the wars and the police state and the Patriot Act and the military commissions, and we're going to cover that in the next segment. But Webster, finishing up with the royals here, looking at this, this Bernaysian, I'm sure you've studied modern advertising and Edward Bernays, the father of it, but in the 20s and 30s, he advised the Department of War, then later the Pentagon. He said, look, royals are unpopular, politicians are unpopular. You have big gala events that are seen as very elite. You have the media cover it, radio and print, and then newsreels in the theaters, later TV. And then you get all of the movie stars and sports stars together with the politicians. You have the politicians hosted, so everyone is bowing to them. And that's all this is a Bernaysian trick, constantly lining up people to have an audience with the Queen, and then they trot out this so-called commoner, so they don't have children that are unrecognizable, which is a smart move for them. Maybe they won't be as insane or brutal and inbreeding these psychopathic tendencies. But they also arrested, including Charlie Veach, peaceful. He's the head of the love police. Folks that were going to just demonstrate against the wedding. So that shows your freedom in England. They had a sweep the last 2 days, picking everybody up who'd even criticized the wedding.
I think you would have to conclude that Great Britain is a police state far beyond anything that we've seen here in the United States.
Well, she's such a nice old lady. With
these closed-circuit TV cameras everywhere. This Windsor dynasty, they have presided over the creation of a police state, and now we have this wedding. Which, again, is being used as a spectacle to essentially brainwash the world. They said, according to CNN, there were 2 billion people watching.
It's so incredible. No one can wait until it comes. The greatest event in history. It's so wonderful. It's fairy tale. They're together. Look at the diamonds. Look at the coach with the cherry interior drawn by 4 white stallions. This is absolutely the height of culture. A bunch of inbred psychopathic killers up there. who run around at cocktail parties wearing Nazi uniforms, one of the princes. I mean, it just goes on and on.
I also would put it in a somewhat broader context. Without being xenophobic, because I'm not, you have to notice that there's now a prevalence of British voices telling you the news. Right? You put on ABC this week, you have Christiane Amanpour, whose center of gravity, wherever she comes from, is obviously London.
Fox TV, but we have a couple British guys, but they're anti-New World Order folks. They're evil too, Tarpley.
We have this guy Piers Morgan today, Piers Morgan on CNN, who's saying, wasn't this a great day for the monarchy? Hasn't the monarchy bounced back from all those troubles with Diana?
No, you're seeing the power of this house.
When you look at Al Jazeera, this is a complete British channel, right there. All the experts.
Sir David Frost?
All of them British intelligence experts from Oxford or Cambridge or Exeter or Reading or all these other universities. What you're creating for the American people is this idea that Americans don't know anything about the world. You have to get a British expert to come and tell you about the world, and that's going to be Amanpour or Piers Morgan or other voices that are now really literally everywhere. There's a tremendous proliferation of this in the news business, and I think that's a really ominous tendency, because it used to be that an American reporter might have a different view, more egalitarian, less sympathetic to colonialism, less sympathetic to imperialism.
No, on average, British reporters are very lapdog to police, state, and authority, anti-gun, knock-kneed, groveling at the feet of power.
Something like this. And anyway, their worldview, since Britain, unfortunately, right, the social mobility, in other words, your chances, if you're born in the bottom 20% economically, your chances of getting to the top 5% right now in the United States are worse than any country in continental Europe. But the British society is even more hierarchical, more stratified, and with less mobility that we have.
And they're the king of cronyism.
So Britain is a completely oligarchical, hierarchical society.
And it's being held up as the model of everything, though it is 1984 control. We'll be back with the birth certificate. Stay with us. Bunch of inbred scum. And they sell the British people that you are British because of this house. This is your identity, is these people that have been sucking off the British people for hundreds and hundreds of years, using their blood for empires, waging war against free societies. It's unbelievable. And in closing, I'll say this about the monarchy. We've spent a lot of time on it because it's an illustration of how they sell things, how they sell the greatest thing on earth is a football game. The greatest thing on earth is watching the prince and some woman getting married. The greatest thing on earth is loving this establishment. That's your identity. Now, Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, you have one final comment on that?
Yeah, look, I also want to point out the beef against the monarchy, actually, that I try to represent anyway, is a strain of thought within England, within Britain. My grandfather was from Wakefield. He was a bricklayer, skilled worker. My grandmother was from Leeds. Okay, so this is the north of England. This is Yorkshire. And in Yorkshire, there is a tradition, which is you don't like the court, you don't like Buckingham Palace, you don't like the City of London, you don't like the Foreign Office, you're suspicious of this entire imperial complex.
Well, that's Robin Hood.
This is, well, it's the north of England. That's a little bit further south, right? Nottingham. This is a strain of thought inside Britain. So it's not that I'm saying British are bad. I'm saying this is a view that is also well represented inside England itself.
No. I mean, they always turn it around like you don't like social, government-run healthcare, you're a racist. You're questioning these birth certificates, you're a racist. Same thing. Oh, you don't like Chinese Communist Party, you don't like Asians. Oh, you don't like the corrupt British Empire, you hate British people. And as you said, Tarpley is Britannic, or it's really all German to begin with. Yeah.
Sure. Anyway, it's a well-established tradition that the north of England, right, the Yorkshire school, is extremely hostile, skeptical against a lot of these manifestations. And I hope there are still some people who keep that going, as I tried to. But to have that come here in the United States, this is now...
Well, it's totally alien to our 1776 spirit.
again, if from the point of view of an American system traditionalist, there is nothing more revolting than the U.S. television coverage of this event, right? Fawning, gaga, idiots.
Well, it's the force-feeding this joke.
Right.
It's like inviting people to a great Sunday dinner and your friends arrive and you're serving rotten possum. And they're holding up a rotten possum crawling with maggots, and they're saying, "Isn't it delicious?" as the maggots are falling on your plate. You're like, "No, it stinks. I need to throw." And they're like, "Oh, it's delicious. Look, we have all these idiots gobbling it." I mean, it's like the emperor's new clothes.
Thank you for this very graphic metaphor. I'm sure the British monarchy will never recover.
Well, I mean, here are these crazed-eyed, evil, drunken people with dozens of mistresses launching all these wars, writing books about how they want a world government to carry out forced extermination.
Yeah, look.
And you got the Rothschild banking cartel marrying in with them, absolutely pushing it as well. In fact, how do the Rothschilds mix into this?
Well, the Rothschilds are one of the banking houses. I mean, if you go back to King Edward VII, he had a group of bankers around him, and a significant number were also Jewish bankers.
Lord Rothschild.
One of the things that Edward VII said to the Jewish banking community in London is, if you want to be admitted into society, Edward VII's problem was he didn't have any money, and he wanted to live on a vast scale. So he said to these bankers, if I give you my investments, his investments were not a lot, I want all the profits to belong to me. I expect you to deliver profits.
Because he had political power, Mommy had all the money.
And she was a recluse. He was the Prince of Wales, and he was really the king, out of Marlborough House in that case. So he said to them, if there are profits, I get the profits, and you jack up the profits. If there are losses, you eat the losses. And this is Sir Ernest Cassel. Rothschild is another example, although they had established themselves somewhat earlier. They got into the...
By double financing both sides of the Napoleonic Wars.
Right, and of course, August Belmont, the guy who ran the Democratic Party from 1850 to, I don't know, 1870, 1880, the whole New York establishment dominated by August Belmont. August Belmont was officially the Rothschild agent in North America.
How did Milner tie into this?
Yeah, Milner is a kind of a think tank, right? The kindergarten, so-called. This is under Edward VII, and here's the problem that they have.
That's why I brought up Milner.
In 1899, you have the Boer War. And what the Boer War shows, first of all, is that the British are militarily very weak, because the Afrikaners in Orange Free State and Transvaal defeat the British imperial forces. They then essentially reveal the weakness of the British. And at that point, Russia, under Count Witte, proposes to France and to Germany, let's form a continental bloc against the British. Let's line up Europe against the British. And unfortunately, it didn't work. It didn't work because the German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, Emperor William II, the Kaiser, was so stupid and was so much of an Anglophile and was so incapable of making strategic decisions that he did not accept this golden opportunity to really prevent World War I by having a continental bloc, Russia, Germany, France, of peaceful economic development and freeze the British out. And therefore, the shock that sent, the 1899, 1900, 1901 isolation of the British, is what then gave the impulse to Milner and Cecil Rhodes and people like this to come up with these round tables to begin a whole new strategy. And that's what then leads, with King Edward leading the charge, to the Triple Entente, the British-French Entente of 1903, and then the really big one is the British-Russian one of 1907-1908, which was considered impossible because the big conflict had been between Russia and the English. But Edward VII was able to paper over all this stuff, and then shortly after he died, that exploded into World War I.
Yeah, they went more into a covert roundtable. CFR is set up around that time in New York. It was pointed out then in the New York papers that weren't controlled by him that why is everything British, British, British? It was the affected style to speak in an Atlantic fake British accent.
Good question, and this is...
That's the Thurston the How. I love you.
One of the puppets of Edward VII was Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was a guy who had, had this identity crisis going, and he wanted to solve this by asserting that he was a member of the Anglo-Saxon master race. So Edward VII would write him letters saying, "Dear President Roosevelt, you and I are the leaders of the two branches of the Anglo-Saxon race. I represent the monarchical one and you represent the democratic one, but we have to work together." And Theodore Roosevelt would go gaga, right? He would say, "Oh my God, the king is treating me like an equal. I've got to do what he says," right? So this essentially the U.S.-British special relationship, if you like.
And this was sold by the Boer War propagandist, Winston Churchill, who then wrote these books that were pumped out, a whole bunch of volumes. I've read several of them, dealing with the history of the English peoples. And
English-speaking peoples, yes, the Anglo-Saxon master race. Now, Winston Churchill, where does he come in? Randolph Churchill is his father. He married this woman, Jenny Jerome. Jenny Jerome came from the basically the New York banking community, dominated by August Belmont and others. So Randolph Churchill died of syphilis, like Prince Eddie, was quite common. The Churchill family, though, is the career of Randolph Churchill was sponsored by Edward VII.
That's Marlborough. Yeah.
And Sir Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, one of his first jobs was that he would write a letter to King Edward VII every day, telling him what had gone on in Parliament that day. So he was also a protege. So the guys who bring you the catastrophes of the 20th century are, in many cases, proteges of Edward VII. But you were talking about Malthusianism, and I think that's also worth talking about. The British East India Company has two guys that essentially define economics today. One is David Ricardo. He's the head of the British East India Company, practically, and he's the source of monetarism, right? Of Milton Friedman, Chicago School, stuff like this. However, they also have a training academy for their executives. It's called Haileybury, and here we have Malthus, Thomas Malthus. He copies things from Venetians. He copies from a guy called Ortes of Venice. But this whole idea that there are too many people, that science and technology can't make a difference.
And that's copied from Plato.
No. This is copied from Ortes. This is copied from Gian Maria Ortes.
No, but I'm saying Plato made some similar comments.
I don't see Plato really on that kind of a line at all. I would say Plato is on the.
Well, he had to duel. From what I've read, he did make comments about overpopulated and.
Look, Plato. A lot of Plato is by indirection. In other words, you can't take individual passages because a lot of times it's going to lead to a. In other words, it's some metaphorical statement.
Because he could be killed for what he was writing, so he did it.
No, there's also that sometimes he says things that turn out to be false later on in the same dialogue. But for sure, Malthus was the big ideologue of the British East India Company, and they ran genocide in India. In other words, you talk about genocide, they did it in India on a vast scale. So Malthus is this idea. World is overpopulated. Science and technology can do nothing. Progress is impossible. It'll always be the same, right? There's no way out of it. That leads to Darwin. That's essentially Darwin's worldview, which is scientifically false. Nietzsche and ultimately Hitler and the Nazis.
And the British royals love this because it said there's elite bloodlines, the world's overpopulated, we ought to spread diseases to kill off the poor. This is Malthus, 250 years ago. And so this goes along and then develops ideas like social Darwinism. We're killing people, doing them a favor. It grows into the eugenics with Galton. Right. And that's this entire stream of where we are today.
And again, Prince Philip. If Prince Philip says he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to come back and kill people and help solve the problem of overpopulation, again, that statement goes beyond anything Hitler ever said.
And that is repeated by all these top professors like Pianka here at UT. This is their religion. You read their writings. To be entered into their club, to get the funding for publications, to be even allowed into the party, you have got to say humans are a parasite, and it's literally a control freak ultimate snobbery where they say, we're going to control history, we're going to set up a control grid, we're going to cut off resources, post-industrial world, we're going to then wipe everybody out. World government is a means to an end. This is a global, hidden Nazi movement.
Answer to that that I would give is the one of Leibniz and essentially of optimism, which is simply that science and technology have repeatedly shown that
Malthus said by 1800 we would have a global collapse and everybody would die, basically.
John Maria Ortiz, that he copied from, said that the absolute upper limit of the carrying capacity of the world is 3 billion. And he said this about 1790 in an essay on population, and Malthus simply took that. So the Malthusian argument is that the population outpaces food production. It's the opposite. Food production outpaces population as long as you simply allow science and technology to be supported. People are wealth. It was their whole approach is scientifically wrong, economically wrong. People are wealth, as Spanish. The Spanish tradition is gobernar es poblar. To govern is to populate. In other words, you want to be a competent government, you want to get anywhere, you've got to...
well, look at us now. I mean, they've done the actuaries. We're not going to be able to pay for the baby boomer aging population because they're not breeding, and they do the actuaries within another 50 years. I mean, it's total collapse. I mean, not even 50. This is all common sense, but you have this view, this feudal view, whether it was Japan, China, Europe, it's always the same tropism, as you put it, that they keep the serfs on 10% of the land. The serfs are starving to death because the elites like to keep them under their thumb. And so it's the same view. So they warp and develop modern sciences that ignore science and use these as preset ideas, and then everything else is spun around those lies.
Well, they hate science, and the history of the whole Royal Society, right, the British Royal Society, is they pretend to promote science. If discoveries are made, they try to pretend they discovered them, but mainly they try to sabotage them. The other thing is this mentality, and we mentioned Theodore Roosevelt. If you look at the American West, right, you fly out here, right, you look at some of these states, the ending of the frontier, right, the passing of the frontier between 1890 and 1900 in America is not, it's premature in the sense that we have a lot of states out here, right, Wyoming, Utah, right, they're basically empty. And the reason that they're empty is that the process of settlement and population growth was artificially stopped by people around Theodore Roosevelt, the great stooge of King Edward II.
Yeah, he sold, freeze the land, have the feds grab it, don't give the land to the people. Exactly. Raise taxes so they can't afford kids.
Gifford Pinchot, this guy, Gifford Pinchot, a key guy.
So he believes in the great supposed Anglo-Saxon, but he actually puts... Well, that's the thing about these eugenicists. They always talk about how great the Germanic or Anglo-Saxon system is, how it's wonderful, but then it's a schizophrenic policy because then they seem to target their supposed own group. What is that?
A good example, back in this Boer War period, right? The first concentration camps of the 20th century, death camps, in effect,
were Afrikaners.
The British putting these Dutch in concentration camps, and you go to them and say, what sense does this make, right? You claim to be a race theorist, but you're putting these Dutch in a concentration camp here in the middle of Africa. What sense does it make? In other words, it's a fraud. In other words, it's ultimately only designed to serve imperial power. What they were concerned about in the case of the United States, the Homestead Act is one of the greatest land reforms in human history, right? The idea that you got this immense expanse and you're going to make that into family farms. And the British and the oligarchs say, no, we don't want that because such people are going to be independent-minded. They're not going to take...
They already had the experience with the British colonies here in North America, and this is the essence, and now they see the rebellion. They see people becoming independent. They see the moves out west to take the 80% of the land held by the feds of the states and serve it out to the people.
Or these ideas that you're going to cut off water to a whole important farming area.
Klamath Falls, Oregon.
Which is simply...
for some fish that isn't even indigenous.
Yeah, the snail darter.
Stay there. We're going to come right back. The essence of the enemy.